Hello, welcome to the second episode of the new series by the Morning Star. My name is Ceren Sagir, and today we're going to be talking about political protesters and their arrests, and how protest rights are under attack in Britain. So we have with us today Tim Crosland, who is from Plan B and Defend Our Juries, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about the legal mechanisms behind these arrests and the way that the system works. So thanks, Tim, for joining us today.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
So we know that it really does seem like there's a increased crackdown on the right to protest in the past few years. You know, we've seen this through the legislative changes that were brought in by the Tories, the previous Tory government, and now it's being enforced by the Labour government. We saw this really recently with the arrests of Palestine protest organisers, and it's something that's been going on for a long time with climate change protesters as well. With what seems like a recent wave of crackdowns and record long sentences being imposed on peaceful action, would you say that sentences are now harsher than they've ever been?
Yeah, in any of our living memories, that is definitely true. And I think just to understand how fast that shift has been, I only need to go back, just a little over 10 years, just for a bit of historical perspective. Some people will remember Pussy Riot in Russia, and that very creative protest in a church against Vladimir Putin. They were sentenced to 2 years in prison. At the time, there was an international outcry. You can go back and you can see the headlines in the Daily Telegraph. You know, global leaders outraged at violation of democratic principles. Well, that's just what happened in Britain in the summer, when Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland were jailed for 2 years for a symbolic action, throwing soup at the glass of Van Gogh's Sunflowers. They were the same age as Pussy Riot, and they got the same sentence, 2 years imprisonment. So that's how far that has shifted. 2 years later, in 2013, again, there was an international storm after Russia jailed the Arctic 30, the Greenpeace protesters who mounted a Russian oil rig in the Arctic. They were jailed for a really short period, a matter of months. Britain was one of the countries leading the international response to secure their freedom. And you had people like David Cameron saying they're not hooligans, they're peaceful protesters. Well, now, in this country, in the same country that was working to secure their freedom, we're making those sentences look trivial in comparison, 4 and 5 years. So that reversal from supposedly, you could discuss and debate this being a champion of human rights internationally, to now being, according to research, the global leader in the repression of peaceful people. It's a stunning turnaround. And the scary thing is the lack of attention on it.
And it also seems that the courts are getting more and more creative with the way that they enforce some of their rules. So, for example, we've been hearing a lot about the consent defence and how the Court of Appeal basically removed that. Could you explain that a little bit to us? What is that defence and why was it removed?
I'm going to explain it in a sort of non-legal, non-technical way, because I think that's just easier to grasp. The obvious example is it's a really hot day, and you see in a car maybe a dog or a child, and all the windows are up. It's really dangerous, and you can see the child, dog, suffering, struggling. You break the window. You don't have the owner's consent to break the window, but you are confident that if they knew what was happening, they would have given their consent. And in that situation, if someone has broken a window to protect a child, they're not going to be prosecuted. That is the defence of consent. In the same way, a burning building, you break a door to get somebody out, you will not be prosecuted and convicted of criminal damage because it's obvious you're doing it to prevent a much greater harm. And so that is a defence that has been used successfully by quite a lot of people in court, effectively saying, we've got something like an addiction to fossil fuels, and you intervene with somebody you care about deeply who's, I don't know, got some form of addiction, whatever it is, and you stage an intervention, and your thought process is, I know this is really what they want. They don't want to be unwell. And it might be surprising, but juries have acquitted quite a lot when they have heard that, because it is powerful. And it also relates to some of the underlying principles in the climate movements, that what we really want are citizens' assemblies, authentic deliberative democracy, where people get to decide, not lobbyists, not corporate lawyers. And that shows this sort of deep trust in people as long as they've got good information. So that's in a way what that defence is all about. The corporate interests, who are very embarrassed by those not guilty verdicts. I mean, it's really embarrassing when you're HSBC and a group of women have broken your windows and the jury goes, yes, we get it, it makes sense. That is alarming. And so what has happened is there's been pressure on the government from various sources, including the Israeli government, including Elbit Systems, who supplies the arms to Israel, including a lobbyist for the oil industry, to remove that defence, because juries were reaching verdicts that those corporations did not like. And shortly after, the Israeli government lobbied the Attorney General to interfere in Palestine Action cases. The Attorney General then files a reference to the Court of Appeal. And to cut a long story short, roughly what happens, in simple terms, is in most cases that defence has been removed. So people now have, that's part of a wider pattern. We've seen similar things following the Colston 4 verdicts. This is the people who toppled a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston into Bristol Harbour. The Attorney General, Suella Braverman, does the same thing. She didn't like that outcome. Take it to the Court of Appeal. Make sure next time the jury aren't given that option, because that was the wrong option. And this has happened now to so many, pretty much all of the defences available. So you have these sham trials in which the jury is told there isn't any defence. There is no basis for people to explain to you why they did what they did. People have even been jailed just for using the words climate change and fuel poverty in court. And then if they're convicted, they can go to jail for 5 years. And it's sort of surreal. I didn't think that was how justice worked.
Yeah, and it kind of brings me on to the case of the whole truth placards then, I guess, because this is an instance where 11 protesters were arrested. For our viewers who might not be familiar with the case, outside Southwark Crown Court last July, simply for holding placards demanding that the jurors hear the whole truth, saying that they deserve to hear the whole truth. One of the placards read, "Jurors have an absolute right to acquit a defendant according to their conscience." So, as you were mentioning, that's another way that it reflects in that. But this time they used contempt laws to remove that influence of what they want to call it. So, how does that apply in that instance to tell the juries?
I mean, the story starts a bit earlier with a woman called Trudy Warner. This is in March 23. And after she's witnessed people being gagged in court and feels juries are being coerced because they're being told that they can't apply their conscience, she holds this sign up with a message that she got taught about at school. She's a 69-year-old retired social worker. Really important principle of democracy. Juries do not have to follow the legal directions of a judge. And it's a principle that is famous from The Clive Ponting case, this goes back to as described, the Falklands War in the 80s. Thatcher telling the public that they had bombed and sunk the Argentine ship, the General Belgrano, with the loss of more than 300 lives because that ship was a threat to British forces. It wasn't true. It was sailing away from the just announced exclusion zone. A civil servant in the Ministry of Defence, Clive Ponting, knew the public had been misled because he had the information. He was in the Ministry of Defence. He gave that information to an MP who shared it with Parliament. No one denied that was the truth, but Clive Ponting was prosecuted for breach of the Official Secrets Act. And the judge tells the jury he has no defence because the public interest is what the government of the day says it is, and the government of the day says it wasn't in the public interest for the public to know the truth of this. And the jury hear this and they go, sorry. I mean, they don't say it because that's not how it works, but they ignore the judge and they find Clive Ponting not guilty. And you can infer that a jury was shocked that a judge was telling them that it's only the government who knows what's in the public interest, and the public interest was to lie. And it's a really good example of the power and significance of juries having that last word on the criminal case. It prevents that kind of stitch-up judges being paid servants of the state. So that is the principle that Trudy Warner was upholding. It was a correct principle. She got arrested by the judge, sent to the Old Bailey, where that same principle is set in marble. And an elongated process where the Solicitor General applies to jail her for contempt of court. Get to the High Court last year. The High Court says, no, this wasn't contempt of court. What she said on her placard was true. You can't be in contempt of court for holding a sign, on the pavement that is true. And we thought that was the end of it. But then the incident that you have just described is in the summer, last summer. It is after the High Court has made that ruling. And the judge knows about that ruling. And still he has those 11 people sitting there completely peacefully with the most simple signs. The jury should hear the whole truth. He has them arrested. He has them detained in the cells for the day. He tells them they are going to be prosecuted. And then the assumption is someone taps him on the shoulder and says, you've lost the plot a little bit, because he then backtracks. And he claims that the reason he's backtracking is because he thinks these people have been exploited by Roger Hallam, which is completely untrue, because Roger Hallam had nothing to do with it. And I would know because I'm one of the organisers of Defend Our Juries, and it's a completely separate campaign. But it was something the judge did just to spare his own blushes.
It really feels like there's a sense of manipulation that's going on with the judicial system. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, if contempt of court means trying to interfere with the judicial process to try and stitch things up and get the verdict you want, well, it's pretty clear who is doing the contempt of court here. It's not the people who just want to explain things honestly to the jury. It's the people who are trying to prevent the jury hearing the evidence, and that is happening systematically. And that's the contempt of court. That's the political interference with the legal process. And it's extremely clear. But, the shocking thing or the disturbing thing is, in one way, it is working, because when the jury gets to hear the evidence, more often than not, they acquit. But if they're not allowed to hear the evidence and they're told the route to verdict, the only question for you to decide is, did the people sit in the road? And if the answer is yes, it's guilty, well, that doesn't leave the jury much to work with. And so there have been a lot more guilty verdicts as a result of this manipulation, and a lot of people in prison now for long periods of time.
It seems like it's not just the courts that are sort of complicit in this. Maybe we can talk a little bit about public bodies and their complicity. So, for example, the General Medical Council and its suspension of an NHS doctor who was protesting. How are they involved in this? How do they tie into this?
Yeah, well, it's now it's two GPs who've been suspended by the GMC, Sarah Ben and Diana Warner, and a third, I believe, has resigned or effectively before the hearing. And these are deeply, deeply caring, well-informed medical professionals who've served the public for years and years through COVID and other things, who have felt their duty as a medical practitioner is to get good information into the public domain, because that's a key determinant of good health, that people understand what's happening. And it's difficult when you've got the corporate lobbyists, pushing against that. And it is very, very shocking, I think particularly shocking and disturbing, that the General Medical Council, whose role is to ensure that its practitioners comply with their duty to the public to protect health, are penalising people for doing exactly that. And it's even more shocking because the Lancet and the World Health Organization have said the climate emergency is the single greatest threat to public health that there is. And we're seeing the evidence of vector-borne diseases like dengue fever coming back into Europe with the rising temperatures. I mean, it's very clear, it's very, very apparent, isn't it? So it is deeply shocking, but it is, I guess, to explain it, it's fear. In a repressive climate where nobody quite knows what the next law is going to be and on what basis you're going to be arrested, people act out of fear. And so, the short answer is very cowardly people on the General Medical Council. I think they know they're cowards.
And I guess there's a serious concern around the fact that direct action works. I mean, we discussed this on the last series with Andrew Feinstein about Palestine Action, for example. But we've seen this with groups like Just Stop Oil as well. Their actions make a difference. Some interesting statistics on their website. They sort of put the arrest figures into context of oil barrels. They've said that they've kept 4.4 billion barrels of oil in the ground, which is equal to over 1.3 million barrels per arrest, which kind of shows that their action contributed to something and helped with some elements. So I guess I want to ask, do you think the ends sort of justify the means in a way?
I think the obligation on all of us, we can all see, because we only need to look out the window, that things are not going that well. And we all need to ask ourselves, well, what's our contribution going to be to that? And it may not be easy. And one of the things to do is to look at the evidence. What are the things that work? What are the things that have worked through history? How was the right to vote for women won? How were racial equality laws won? Gender equality laws, workers' rights, how were they won? And it was not by just sitting politely, writing little letters. It wasn't. Anyone who thinks it was just doesn't know their history about this. And part of what we want to do with our Free Political Prisoners exhibition is just remind people. Downstairs, Sylvia Pankhurst, she was in prison. Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, Gandhi, a lot of the people who were celebrated in Parliament Square, Nelson Mandela with statues, in and around Parliament Square, they all spent time in prison because they adopted the tactics that are the only way you ever hold power to account.
Let's talk about civil injunctions. I guess these are something that we hear about as well. What are they usually used for, and how are companies using them to target climate activists?
Well, a standard injunction might be taken out to prevent a harm. So, for example, if somebody is being stalked by someone or something like that, they might get the person who is being stalked might get an injunction to stop the person pursuing them. And then if the person continues to pursue them, they're in contempt of court and can be brought before the court. So that you might say that's a good use of an injunction to protect people in that way. What some of the fossil fuel companies have been doing is employing armies of lawyers to extend this concept to something completely different, where they essentially buy their own laws. They send their lawyers to the Royal Courts of Justice and say, it's very difficult and distressing for us having people protesting, outside our businesses, and it puts off customers, and we want an injunction to stop it. And a lot of the time they are getting those injunctions, with the consequence that people who feel it's important to highlight the harm some of those companies are doing get prosecuted not only under the criminal law, but also for breach of an injunction, and then end up not only jailed in some cases for that, but with huge costs, because the lawyers then charge the people who've broken the injunction for the cost of the injunction, and those lawyers are not cheap, and the cost can end up being £500,000. So things that are devastating in their implications. And it goes under the radar a little bit. People don't hear about it, probably people don't understand it in quite the same way as they do the criminal law. So it's just another way in which the law has been twisted and corrupted by lobbyists and lawyers. And one short concrete example that makes this feel a bit more real, Dr. Sarah Ben, a wonderful, wonderful GP, she's been suspended. A US-based oil company, Valero, took out an injunction around people protesting on its site. Sarah Ben thought it was important to take a stand for public health. She stood on a grass verge within the injuncted area with a sign that said, "Just stop oil," and for that she was imprisoned. She had done it twice, so she had repeatedly done that. And the court said, right, you breached the injunction, and she was jailed for that. So there you have a woman GP jailed for holding a sign because of the injunction. So it gives you a sense of the power of these evil things.
So you mentioned some of the lobbying that goes on behind the scenes of this. And I think a good way of talking about this is talk about Lord Wolney and his report. Back in last year, Lord Wolney, who was a so-called independent extremism advisor to the government, he released a report about political violence and disruption. And it was interesting because he suggested groups like Palestine Action and Just Stop Oil, they should be treated harsher than criminals even. But we know that he's not actually independent, is he? He has these ties to oil and arms industries. Could you tell us a little bit about his background and what kind of impact his report and his ties to these industries had on policies?
Yes, and just worth mentioning why I think we're talking about Lord Wolney, not because we think he's the exception to the rule, it's because he personifies the rule, and maybe a little bit the way, for example, Harvey Weinstein was the sort of almost extreme personification for the Me Too movement. Nobody really thought the only problem in Hollywood was Harvey Weinstein, but he was almost that face of it, wasn't he? And Wolney, as I see him plays a similar kind of role because it's so extreme, it's so extraordinary. He left the Labour Party in 2018, formerly known as John Woodcock, I should say, aka John Woodcock is his real name, amid sexual misconduct allegations that still haven't been properly investigated. And Boris Johnson in 2020, who's Prime Minister at the time, says, well, don't worry, John, there's always room for you at our table, and appoints him to the House of Lords, and then makes him government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. And since then, he's taken paid employments with, and he's actually sort of the partner chair for something called the Purpose Coalition. It sounds nice and purposeful, but it's actually a lobbying group for companies including BP, who've been the target of Just Stop Oil action, and for Leonardo, one of the world's leading arms manufacturers who supplies arms to the Israeli government, who have directly been the subject of Palestine action campaigns. He is also a paid lobbyist for Ruud Pedersen, who have amongst their clients Glencore, the oil and gas giant. He's also the vice chair for the all-party parliamentary group on AUKUS, or whatever, that's the defence alliance between the UK, US and Australia. That's funded by the ADS group, which has also been targeted by Palestine Action because of their support for genocide in Gaza. And he used to be Labour chair of Friends of Israel. And you can discuss and debate whether he's entitled to those views, but it's a curious idea that that makes him independent. He's independent in advising on the people who are exposing the violence and lies of the companies that are paying him. I mean, that's more wild than saying that Roger Hallam should be the independent advisor on protest. Roger is a brilliant guy with a lot of experience on protest, but I don't think anyone would think that Roger Hallam should be the independent advisor on protest. It would just be silly to suggest that. Someone who's obviously got skin in the game, right, is not independent. But the thing that is crazy to my mind anyway is that the Labour government, who promised a different kind of politics and promised to clean up politics, decided to adopt Lord Wolney. And he's now their independent political advisor on protest, roughly, embedded right in the heart of the Home Office with Yvette Cooper. And it was since his report in May, which called for Just Stop Oil and Palestine Action to be treated, as you said, like serious organised criminals, that is exactly what's happened. It was in the months after that report in May, between July and September, that we see this extraordinary inflation of sentences. And we also see Palestine Action and members of Palestine Action and journalists being charged under the Terrorism Act, which again is the sort of Overton window that Wolney deliberately opened. So it's not that he's a sort of harmless, figure in all of this. You can see how that corruption, which is what it is, that lobbying is twisting and distorting and corrupting the legal process.
Yeah, and I suppose it's just one example of how there are different avenues used by fossil fuel companies and big firms as well to shape public policy. Is there any others that you think are relevant to our viewers?
Yeah, I think it's so deep you almost don't see it. The roots of it are so deep. But I just remember 2015, this was my first involvement in the climate movement, just ahead of the Paris conference, the COP conference, and I was there acting for some of the small island states as a legal advisor. And you couldn't call the Paris Agreement a treaty, because if you called it a treaty, it was going to have to go through US Congress. And it was never going to go through US Congress because everybody knew that the fossil fuel industry had captured a majority or a sufficient amount of Congress for that never to happen. So there you have the international legal framework on the climate crisis having to fit systematic corruption, but most people not calling it corruption. Coming back to the UK, we had Rishi Sunak thanking Policy Exchange, so-called think tank, for drafting the laws that resulted in the conviction and sentencing of the Whole Truth 5, the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act 2022, maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment for causing any interference with anything, basically. And Rishi Sunak thanks Policy Exchange for drafting that. Vice magazine and various others, showed that Policy Exchange have received funding from big oil. So it's almost, so common that people hardly notice it.
Let's talk about the current Labour government, because as I mentioned at the start, obviously there was a lot of legislative changes that were introduced by the Tories, but it's interesting because when Labour first came into power in July, one of the first things they did was to say that they won't be signing any new oil and gas licenses. And this is actually one of the demands that Just Stop Oil was calling for. So it seems like there isn't a complete conflict of interest. There are some overlapping, for whatever reason, there are some overlapping items on the agenda, but it's kind of interesting. Does that mean that they kind of agree that their protesting all this time was justified? And if so, why is the other actions not justified if they have that big of an impact?
Well, to anyone with any integrity, you'd think that, you'd think that was right, wouldn't you? If people had put their bodies on the line to expose the danger of Tory completely deranged policies of maxing out on oil and gas, was how Sunak put it, flying in the face of all the expert advice and all the science. And it took people putting their bodies on the line to draw attention to that. And it was only in the months after those Just Stop Oil actions on the M25 that Keir Starmer himself says, we get into power, when we get into power, we will stop new oil and gas licenses. So again, that correlation, that cause and effect, is pretty clear. You'd think he'd have some time with the people who drew attention to that, but not at all. He makes that policy announcement and then says absolutely got no time for the people who interfere with ordinary people. So it's disingenuous, it's lacks any integrity. But I will say too, it's not quite clear what they meant by new oil and gas licenses. Starting to look as though what they meant was no new licenses for exploration, but new licenses for production. Always in the small print. So the big headline statement at the beginning of government, and then as happens, and it's been happening for decades, the reality swiftly becomes a little bit different. And we've just seen in the last couple of days the split between Reeves, the Chancellor, and Miliband over expansion at Heathrow. And Keir Starmer today saying, this is the international human rights lawyer, we will bring in legislation to stop people bringing legal claims against big infrastructure projects, because growth comes first, economic growth comes first. And that's what Rachel Reeves has been saying too. And just think that through, because it can sound plausible initially when a politician says it, but those climate targets are the minimum necessary to avoid apocalypse, mass loss of life, and whole regions of the world becoming uninhabitable. And so the idea that anything would take priority over that, if you just pause for a second to think about what that really means, it's incoherent. You could only say that if you were in the grip of a pretty strange ideology.
I mean, the irony is kind of so far-stretching in this area that it's absolutely ridiculous. But do you think that Labour will go back on any of the legislative changes that were brought in?
At the moment, it's not clear that they will. I mean, the first real test was the challenge, the successful legal challenge that Liberty had brought against Suella Braverman, I think it was, changing the law through the back door on protest using a statutory instrument, in other words, not approved by Parliament, to make it much easier to stop protest. And Liberty challenged that. The High Court said that Liberty was correct. The Tories should not have done that. That was a misuse of secondary legislation. Suella Braverman, or would have been maybe somebody else by then, but the Tory Attorney General appealed to the Court of Appeal. When Labour came into power, they said they would have a think about whether they were going to continue that appeal, and we all thought they'd drop it. But it's Yvette Cooper's decision, actually, and it's the Home Secretary's decision. She has Walney in the office with her, and after taking time to think about it, she is now pursuing the appeal against that High Court ruling. In other words, she's come right into Suella Braverman's shoes on this. So if that is any indication, no, we're not expecting any repeal, just adopting precisely the same approach as their predecessors.
Yeah, and another area that they were very much focused on immediately into coming into power was sort of the overcrowding problem in prisons, the crisis surrounding that. There's so many political prisoners in jail at the moment. One of the things they said about this was that is their typical line about inheriting this problem from the Tories. But it doesn't feel like, regardless of the release of prisoners, it doesn't feel like they're actually helping the situation if they're imprisoning peaceful people, peaceful activists.
Yes, well, it's interesting because one of the prisons people are being kept in, HMP Bronzefield, a women's prison. The Palestine Action and Just Stop Oil women there are treated as the most dangerous of all the prisoners, and that they're not allowed to associate with each other. Just Stop Oil prisoners can't associate with Palestine Action prisoners. And of course, we are talking about deeply, deeply peaceful, principled people who are trying to stop atrocities. And that's my understanding of non-violence. Non-violence doesn't mean just sitting back quietly in a corner. Non-violence means if there is violence, there is a duty to intervene in whatever way is going to be effective. But from the position and the perspective of oil companies and arms companies, the people whose tactics are effective, and both groups are strikingly effective, they're dangerous. They're dangerous not just because they're threatening those firms' profits, but they're drawing attention to the insanity of the political trajectory that we're on, and thinking that more growth, more short-term profits is always the answer. So people who expose a flawed ideology are seen by some people as the most dangerous of them all. So that's what this is about.
It seems that there is a worrying trend that's taking place, and the concern, I guess, is that this can continue. If it does continue, what could Britain be looking like in 10 years' time in terms of the right to protest?
I wonder how long it's going to continue, because we're up against something that often feels, it can sound a bit exaggerated, but it depends what your experience is. Recent experience of hospitals, schools, the prison system, the court system, and the more close up people get, the more you start to think, this feels like a failing state. And one interpretation is the extremity of the repression we're facing is the action of a bully that knows it's weak. And it's a bully that knows one of the most powerful tools of its violence, the prison system, is collapsing. And it knows that one of the other of its most powerful tools, the court system, is in crisis. Cases not being heard for years, and barristers not being paid enough to take cases. And it can't keep going on. The belief, I think Lady Justice Carr's belief, she's the Lady Chief Justice who will hear the appeal, the mass appeal at the end of the month. Her justification previously for this type of sentencing was deterrence. This is going to make the problem go away. Not the deep problem of ecological crisis or genocide in Gaza, but the people who draw attention to that. We're going to make them go away, and then we don't have to hear about it. But what she's arguing against is human nature. She's arguing against that kind of profound drive for people not to give up and for people to keep fighting, because it's like everything. So you can't deter that. It's not possible to deter it. And when we have 1,000 people on the streets at the end of this month, as we will do when those cases are being heard, there's a kind of practical reality. The system will not cope with arresting and prosecuting and jailing all those people. It can't do it. So we're going to get to some sort of moment when, it can't go on. It's not sustainable, even if they want it to be.
I think that brings us on to talking about Plan B and Defend Our Juries as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about these groups and sort of what kind of actions you're taking, and how viewers as well who are interested in this topic can support these groups.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because like a lot of what we've been talking about, it's quite difficult stuff, isn't it? It's not you don't want to think about living in a country where there isn't any real freedom in that sense. But the most crucial thing, and it starts to feel better immediately when people are coming together and taking action and standing on the streets together. Defend Our Juries, our objectives are to shine a spotlight on this repression, because this level of repression only survives if people don't really know about it. You drag it into the light, you drag the Lord Walneys of the world into the light like vampires, right? They do not like it. So that's what we have to do. And we will have, at the end of the month, where an extraordinary mass appeal is taking place of 16 members of Just Stop Oil, who in a period of just 2 months between July and September of last year, jailed for a combined 41 years, including Phoebe and Anna, who threw the soup at the sunflowers, and the Whole Truth 5. Those cases are being reviewed by the Court of Appeal outside the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. And it's a huge moment, all those cases coming together. And there will be, lots of people on the second day, the 30th of January, around midday. There will be 1,000 people occupying the Strand to make it clear that this, cannot go on, so that all that Lady Justice Carr has to do is to look outside her window to see that the deterrence is not working, and to use those basic democratic rights that have won all our freedoms through history. So that's what we're going to do. And I would urge anyone who's listening, who's feeling a little bit despondent about some of the state of things, to get onto the Defend Our Juries website. You will see there all the information you need to come and join us. And it will be spectacular, and it will feel you will know that you're on the right side if you're there.
So, Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. I believe that, our readers especially are really interested in this subject because it is a huge attack on our right to protest. And I hope they found it as insightful as I did today. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today. We will see you soon with another episode. But in the meantime, please remember to subscribe to The Morning Star to keep up to date with issues like the right to protest, but also many, many more. And a final date that I do want to plug in with you is June 14th, when Morning Star will be having its conference at Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church in London. So I hope to see you then as well.